Now? Okay. The COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on food security. Joseph Schmidhuber, Deputy Director of the Trade and Markets Division at the Food and Agriculture Organization, is here to tell us just how big that impact is, if any at all. Mr. Schmidhuber, good day to you.
Hello.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So my first question has to do precisely with food commodities. They seem to be at a good price right now. The question is, where do you predict a food crisis under the current circumstances? I mean, we are hearing about places like Afghanistan, East Africa, and the Middle East. So why there and not elsewhere?
Yeah, indeed, to come back to the first part of your question, food prices in US dollars are indeed at very low levels. So adjusted for inflation, they're probably at all-time lows or very close to all-time lows. And that's indeed a crucial difference to the 2007-2008 crisis. And at the same time, it's an automatic stabilizer for food security at the international level. So we have lower GDP growth or negative GDP growth, high unemployment, but at the same time we have lower food prices. So that's in many ways good news. But we need to be careful. So what we saw at the same time are sharp currency devaluations. And these sharp currency devaluations essentially mean that prices in local currencies haven't fallen as much as they did in US dollars. So that's quite important to understand. Prices in local currencies are not as low as they are for international markets and expressed in US dollars. At the same time, we also see some commodities actually at relatively high prices, particularly fruits and vegetables, because there we actually had some logistical problems. And so that's another issue. And then it's also possible that prices for grains and oilseeds are high at the local level, simply in locations where international to domestic price transmission is low, so in landlocked countries, Afghanistan, for instance, or countries with poor infrastructure. And so you can have local prices at very high levels, not only because of currency devaluations, but also because of supply bottlenecks. Yeah, East Africa is actually the region that's hit by several crises at the same time. So we have a health crisis because of COVID-19. But there's also a food production crisis due to locust. Mr. Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank, always talks about locust-19, just trying to express the importance of the locust problem in East Africa. So he essentially puts it at the same level as the COVID problem. At the same time, there is a security crisis, there's civil strife, there's even terrorism, and that's another problem. And I think the next area you mentioned was the Middle East.
That's right.
The problems in the Middle East are yet different. So many of the countries there are dependent on exports of oil and gas. So typically, so we call these hydrocarbon exports, and they need the income from these exports to finance their cereal imports. So yeah, colloquially put, what they do is they export hydrocarbons to import carbohydrates. And as the revenues from hydrocarbon exports are actually under downwards pressure, it's not so easy for them to purchase grains. They still have, of course, enough money, but it can be a problem there. But again, I mean, in a way, commodity prices for food are an automatic stabilizer, because unlike 2007, 2008, there is actually food that can be imported and at relatively low prices. So that's good for them. But the Middle East is also hit in much more subtle ways. And one is, of course, many countries in the Middle East are dependent on tourism, and some of them have a very strong hospitality sector. So that means that not only the local population is suffering there, but also the workers that are working there from abroad. So they have much reduced incomes and then hence less money to send back to their relatives at home. So remittances are a big issue. Simply put, if there is an unemployed hotel worker or a taxi driver or a gig economy worker, they have no money back to send back to their home countries right now. And a classical examples are the Gulf Cooperation countries and the many guest workers they have from South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Over.
So although food prices are low, but we are seeing food export plans in producers for countries like Thailand and India. If there is no food concern, why is this happening?
Well, because there's no food concern, it is happening. So they can export because they have enough food. What one did see at the same time are food export restrictions, and perhaps that's what you mean. So some of these countries actually imposed export restrictions, but because there is enough food, we have very low prices, and there are very few export restrictions. Now, there were some. There was one by Kazakhstan, and also Ukraine and Russia imposed some export restrictions, but actually at very high levels. So what was happening is that their export restrictions were pitched at a level where they de facto did not pose any real restrictions. So they were posed at the level where we expected exports to be over the next 6 months. So de facto, it wasn't a restriction. But what's happening there is also that many of these countries see, particularly commodity exporters, see their currencies falling in value, and actually very strongly so. But their currencies are not falling because of the food situation. Their currencies are falling because we have sharp contractions in prices for metals and hydrocarbons, etc. So a country like Kazakhstan sees its overall currency fall because its overall exports go down, and that makes the currency so competitive that the country can also export food, which it couldn't otherwise, and hence actually it has to impose export restrictions in order to ensure food security at home.
Mm-hmm. Now, as far as I understand it, traditionally regimes that are faced with food shortages normally respond with subsidies. To what extent is this now possible?
Well, I wouldn't want to use the term regimes. I think that all countries have been doing that, and OECD countries more than others. But also non-OECD countries are still able to use subsidies, and it depends on how strongly these subsidies are coupled to production. At least as long as we are talking about the WTO framework. So within the WTO framework, we have 3 major boxes, and they essentially are distinguished by the degree of coupling of the subsidy to production. But even the most coupled subsidies, so what's in the so-called AMPA box, even these subsidies can still be increased as long as countries remain below their so-called AMS limit. So even that is possible. And there was quite some leeway for countries like the US, even though they're now exhausting that, but they still had quite some leeway under the WTO rules. Developing countries actually can seek recourse to Article 6.2 of the agreement on agriculture, which essentially allows them to support investments in agriculture for food security purposes. So again, there is some leeway for higher subsidies. It's possible.
Mm-hmm. And finally, when it comes to the relation between food security and market fluctuations, where would you be more worried right now?
Well, right now we don't see strong market fluctuations, at least not price fluctuations at the international level. So for the bulk commodities such as wheat or maize or soybeans, prices are rather flat and at very low levels. So there is very little price fluctuation. And it's even smaller if the prices are deflated. So it's not too much to worry about here. But as alluded to in the beginning of the interview, I think the situation can be quite different at the national or at the local level. So particularly where access to food is rather is limited or impeded. So typically the world market provides, as we call it, a very elastic supply for food markets. But when countries don't have access to the world market because of a lack of infrastructure or local shortages or policy problems, then that can, of course, result in a price hike. We haven't seen big price hikes so far. We've seen price increases at the local level, but even at the local level, this price reactions are way below those that we witnessed in 2007, 2008.
Mr. Schmidt-Wilbur, thank you very much for your time.
Sure, you're welcome.